right. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Gianna. I'm the head of reference here at the Chelmsford Public Library. I'm going to give a brief introduction of tonight's program. And just so everyone knows, if you don't know the drill by now, any questions or comments throughout the presentation, please pop them into the chat or Q&A section of your Zoom menu down the bottom of your screen. Jane will get to those later on. All right. So tonight we have Art on Thursdays, Devil with a Brush, Caravaggio's dramatic masterpieces. Caravaggio's turbulent life story reads like a crime thriller, making him one of art history's most captivating and controversial figures. He was a revolutionary Italian painter of the Baroque era, as famous for his violent temper and criminal behavior as he was for his groundbreaking artistic techniques. Caravaggio's paintings reflect his tumultuous life with dramatic lighting and intense realism. The program provides an overview of the artist's life and his body of work. So our presenter tonight is Jane Oneail. She is a sought-after speaker, educator, and independent art historian. Jane curates and delivers engaging art appreciation programs through her company, Culturally Curious, founded in 2017. Born and raised in New Hampshire, she has worked at some of the state's most esteemed cultural institutions, including the League of New Hampshire Craftsmen, where she served as executive director, and the Currier Museum of Art, where she held the role of senior educator. So without further ado, I will pass it over to Jane to get us started.
Thank you so much, Gianna. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your day to spend it with art, to spend it with me. I'm so humbled. I'm delighted you're here. Now you get to kind of kick back and indulge in some pretty incredible images and stories tonight, too, because Caravaggio just created these sensational paintings, and he had the scandalous life to match the paintings. So we'll see tonight how his work represents this dramatic departure from the Italian Renaissance. And we'll also see how his choices essentially influence not just a generation of artists, but 100 years of artists across a continent. It's pretty spectacular. We will be getting back to this image on the screen in just a little bit, but I want to give you a sense in terms of how we'll spend our time together tonight. So our program overview here, another dramatic scene. I'll tell you a little bit about this one in just a second. We'll get started with an introduction to the Italian Baroque. And really to understand it, you have to see how it is a contrast to the Italian Renaissance. So we're going to do a little compare and contrast there. Then we'll turn our attention to Caravaggio. He had a short life, but man, there was a lot packed into it. And instead of spending all of our time talking about biography, I've picked out a few images to kind of give you the highlights reel. Then we'll talk about what makes his work so interesting and so definitive for the entire period of the Baroque: realism, his use of perspective, and his very shady crime scenes. And those tend to kind of, form a nice little parallel with his life there too. We'll wrap up with his influence and legacy. So before I change slides here, we have a little peek at that realism. We have a little peek at the criminality of his paintings too, because this is an attempted slaughtering that we're looking at here, and it's a biblical story. It's Abraham was told by God to sacrifice his son Isaac. So we can see the young boy completely terrified and confused about what his father is going to do. Notice the wrinkles on the hands and at the wrists and on his father's furrowed brow. These look like real people. There's an immediacy to these works. You feel like you've walked into a dark alley and you've stumbled upon something you shouldn't see. All right, let's get started with our introduction to the Italian Baroque. I love to talk about the Baroque, especially in contrast to the Italian Renaissance. So when we're thinking about these two periods, hold these magical years in your head. Basically, the Italian Renaissance is 1500 and the Italian Baroque is 100 years later, 1600. So it's to our benefit to actually start off with these two sculptures. Caravaggio was a painter, but we're going to sort of get a fuller understanding of the Baroque by also looking at sculpture and a little bit of architecture too. So we have on the left our example of an Italian Renaissance sculpture. It's Michelangelo's David. We've all probably seen it a zillion times by now. And then on the right, we have the answer to that. About 100 years later, this is the Baroque David made by the sculptor Bernini. So a couple of major contrasts here right off the bat. We know the story of David is the young shepherd boy who goes up against Goliath, the giant. He uses his slingshot with a stone to kind of take the giant down. And so Michelangelo carves David looking physically perfect. He's like an action hero posing here just before this confrontation. And Bernini instead gives us a very dynamic figure. And we'll talk a little bit about this dynamism in just a moment. I do want to just turn our attention to Michelangelo's David for a second, because when we think about sculpture, we think of it as a medium that you can view from 360 degrees. Obviously, you can walk all the way around a sculpture, but Michelangelo's carving of David is really meant to be seen from this position. This is where he looks his absolute best. In fact, if you start to rotate around the sculpture, it's just not quite as extraordinary from that frontal view. But by the time we get to the Italian Baroque, artists are thinking differently, and they want to engage their viewers in every way possible. So Bernini's David, this young boy with the slingshot who's, determined to take down this giant, Bernini's David is a sculpture that you have to view from every single angle. You have to walk around it to fully appreciate it, in order to see the look of determination on this young man's face, in order to see how all of the muscles in his body are taut, how he's torqued sort of like a spring here, and even the slingshot itself is pulled taut here. So it involves us as a viewer in this absolutely wonderful way. In fact, it not that it surpasses the Italian Renaissance, but it surprises you and reminds you of ways that art can engage you in ways that the Italian Renaissance did not. Now, I am actually going to skip over this next. Oh, here we go. We're going to turn our attention to architecture now and sort of see this difference between the Renaissance and the Baroque in terms of structures. We have our Renaissance example on the left again, our Baroque example on the right. So on the left, this is known as the Villa Rotunda. It was designed by the architect Palladio, and it's essentially a square with a circular dome and these classical porches on each side. It's a completely symmetrical structure. You approach it from any angle and you can deduce what is happening on the other facades of the building. Now, the Baroque sculpture that I have, or the Baroque art, work of architecture here that I have on the right is completely different. This is the facade of a church in Rome called San Carlo alle Quattro Fontane. And the architect here is named Borromini. He's using some of the language of the classical past. We can see some columns and some cornices, but he has not restricted himself to the perfect symmetry and the perfect geometries of the Italian Renaissance. He doesn't need the circle. He doesn't need the square. In fact, he shows you in various places that he's going to elongate the circle. He's got ovals all over the surface of the facade of this church. And what's more, the facade is actually an undulating line. I mean, really, until this moment in architecture, nothing like this had ever been built before. This is a space that is intended to surprise you. The Villa Rotunda is one that is rational, it's sensible. You're supposed to understand it in a cerebral way. The church over here on the right is appealing to other parts of you. And in fact, it is supposed to be an appeal to your emotions, maybe even your soul. Very quickly, here are the plans for those same buildings. The Villa Rotunda, like I said, a circle within a square. Each side of that square is identical to the others. Here is the facade of that same church we were looking at with that wavy line there. And you can see when you go inside, it's not a circle, it's another oval. So it's more undulating lines here. This is a space that, again, It's not meant to be a reasonable, rational space. It is meant to conjure something else in you and to connect with the worshipers on a different level. So this is sort of our preamble before we get to painting. But now we are finally getting to painting, and now you can finally see a Caravaggio. So I have Caravaggio here on the right as our example of a Baroque painting. And on the left, we have an Italian Renaissance painting by the artist Raphael. And there's so many things that we could contrast. We could probably spend a week contrasting these two works. But back in the Italian Renaissance, we can see through Raphael's example that there was a goal, there was an aim to try and render, especially divine figures, looking absolutely physically perfect. Divinity was translated to physical perfection. So our Madonna here looks like she could be on the cover of a magazine even today. She's absolutely picturesque, right? Uh, we also have a very stable composition. We have this pyramidal composition. Even the babies here, John the Baptist and the Christ child, formed their own pyramid within the pyramid. Now, these figures are sort of evenly lit. We don't see any real dark shadows here, but there's just enough shadow to suggest the three-dimensionality of their forms. We have these saturated colors, the beautiful red and blue of the Virgin's mantle, and then we can see way off into the distance, um, seemingly for miles, right? So we have this concept of a Renaissance painting. It's functioning like a window onto a world, a window that it makes you feel like you could step right into and experience yourself. So lots to contrast here with our first look at Caravaggio. So this is his painting, Calling of St. Matthew, from the year 1600. So roughly 100 years after Raphael. We've lost that even lighting. Right now, it's deep, dark shadows, just like a streak of light across the middle of the painting. And art historians refer to these shadows with the Italian term chiaroscuro, or because Caravaggio's shadows are so dark, they're almost black, sometimes this is referred to as tenebrism. What we see along with those shadows is such dramatic lighting, it almost looks like stage lighting in a theater in present day. I mean, obviously they didn't have spotlights back then, but that's the total effect. Art historians refer to that effect as the cellar window lighting. So you get the sense that you're, underground, subterranean, and there's just like this shaft of light that comes into many of his pictures. Now, before we saw the Madonna as idealized as could be, and here she is front and center. There's no questioning who is the most important figure in this painting. Now, in Caravaggio's painting, we have Jesus. He is actually supposed to be the most important person in this picture, but he is actually almost totally in shadow. And he just has like this little tiny hairline halo here that's very easy to miss. He looks like a regular man. There's not much here that makes him stand out from any other bearded individual in the room. So Caravaggio is kind of like bearing the lead with a picture like this. He's not using the same formula for storytelling as we saw in the Renaissance. We also don't have that nice stable composition that we saw here with the triangle and the pyramid. Instead, what we'll see in the Italian Baroque is a strong emphasis on diagonals. Here we have that shaft of light. It kind of breaks up this picture. There's a lot of empty space, a lot of negative space in the composition, but it also creates a little bit of dynamism that you wouldn't normally see in a Renaissance painting. Now, there's something else happening with Caravaggio's painting here, which we'll see again and again in his pictures, and that is a very shallow pictorial space. Essentially, it feels like we're watching a play with a stage set right behind it. Instead of seeing a landscape that goes off for miles, instead, we're in this tight, compressed space. We are in that cellar, right? So Caravaggio has really upended all of the rules. And part of this is because we are now entering the Protestant Reformation and the church's counter Reformation. So the Catholic Church has to speak to the masses in a whole new way. And they discover Caravaggio and his particular talent for reaching the average person. So I want to tell you a little bit more about this painting of the calling of St. Matthew, because this is a picture of a religious conversion. It is literally the light of God shining on like a tax collector who in this moment it suddenly understands Jesus and is being converted. So we can see Jesus's hand is just sort of lazily lifted up here. He's not even fully articulated that finger to point at an individual, but we do see this man here facing the light and seemingly pointing at himself, like this is the moment of his religious awakening. Art historians even debate which one of these figures might be Matthew. It could be this older gentleman who's still counting the money, who doesn't yet realize that Jesus has walked in the room. Maybe he's actually pointing to the guy next to him. It's fun to kind of have those debates, but we can see that that Caravaggio uses light in a really powerful way in his pictures. Oftentimes, the light is telling us where to look and what's most important, as opposed to a very stable composition. Now, one last interesting connection between Caravaggio and the Italian Renaissance from 100 years earlier is that his name was actually Michelangelo de Caravaggio. Caravaggio, in this case, is sort of like Vinci. It's where he was from. It's this tiny little town. And if you remember our Leonardo program from a couple months back, people find it sort of ridiculous sometimes if you refer to Leonardo da Vinci as Da Vinci, because it's literally just saying of Vinci. It's from that town. But for some reason, it's perfectly fine to refer to Caravaggio as Caravaggio, even though it basically means the same thing. But his first name was actually Michelangelo, which creates this nice tie back to Michelangelo himself. And so here I bring back Michelangelo's image of the creation of man, that detail from the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And maybe you've already made the connection here yourself, but there is something about the very lazy way that Adam raises his hand up to meet the finger of God here that's pretty similar to the way that Michelangelo Caravaggio has painted Jesus. So it seems like a nice kind of counterpoint. And for an artist who spent most of his professional career in Rome, I can imagine that he was looking at Michelangelo's work pretty closely. All right, so let's now turn our attention fully to Michelangelo de Caravaggio. We are now looking at a sketch of the artist. He was born in 1571, and like I said, he had a pretty short life. We will see that he dies before the age of 40. This is not a self-portrait done by a fellow artist, but I find it to be a fascinating portrait because he looks angry, right? He looks like he resents whoever's created this image of him. He's practically sneering in this portrait. And that seems to align very closely with what we know about this young man. Well, first of all, he had a pretty challenging upbringing. His family was sort of wiped out by the plague. By the time he was a teenager, he was fully orphaned. And so he kind of had to make a way for himself. So by the time he was uh, in his early 20s, he had moved from that small town of Caravaggio to Rome. He was doing like any sort of painting gig that he could get, and was eventually discovered by the church and continued to receive commissions for quite some time, despite his erratic behavior. As one art historian said, Caravaggio was a man who was given to wrath and riot. And we could spend a lot of time going over his various crimes. I will be pointing many of them out tonight. But instead, like I said, we're going to sort of get a shorthand for understanding Caravaggio through some of his really interesting images. So I want to set the stage with this first image here. This is a Caravaggio, a later Caravaggio, and there's some dispute as to the attribution. It's simply called The Tooth Puller. It's from about 1608 to 1610. And what we're looking at here, of course, is classic Caravaggio. It's that shallow pictorial space, it's the black background, and it's just kind of a brutal scene where we can see this young man is getting his tooth pulled, presumably without any sort of anesthesia. And what's astonishing about this picture is that this is just entertainment for the people that are surrounding him. We wince, we cover our eyes when we think about how awful it would be to have a tooth pulled this way. And it's a reminder for us that in the 1600s, Rome was a very rough place to live. And Caravaggio was one of those people that made it very rough. He essentially was the leader of a gang, and he had a reputation for working very hard on his paintings for about 2 weeks and then spending 2 months roaming the streets of Rome and sort of terrorizing people. We'll get into those details along the way. So first, life in Rome is rough. Our next image here to sort of give us an introduction to the artist is it's called Young Sick Bacchus. This is a very early work from Caravaggio. It's from 1593. And it's understood to be a self-portrait of the artist. And it's a very interesting choice. I'm sure many young men could identify with the god of wine and the god of having a good time. But in this case, Caravaggio has painted himself as a sick Bacchus. What does that mean? Bacchus is hung over. In any event, Bacchus here has like gray skin, yellowish skin, gray lips here. And he's sort of weirdly hunched over. It's almost like an androgynous pose. There's something sort of sickening to the entire picture here. So what does that tell us about Caravaggio? Maybe that he's a little bit of a wild child. And if you haven't already sort of gleaned that from what I've shared with you so far, I'd like to emphasize that a little bit more. He was somebody who was fairly out of control. In fact, there were many people in his life that referred to him as a madman. So not only was he the god of a good time, but he would take things too far in almost every scenario that he was in. Now, just to provide a little bit of contrast here, Caravaggio did paint other Bacchuses, and you can see that they are seductive and even kind of alluring, offering you a drink that you'd be happy to take, where this one you might want to just step back and kind of run away. Now, he was living in a rough time. He was a wild child. Our next big idea about Caravaggio was that he was an influencer way back in the 1600s. And we come to this conclusion by way of this astonishing painting. It's just breathtaking, isn't it? This is called The Taking of Christ from 1602. It's at the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin. So I know some of my biblical stories best through Jesus Christ Superstar. So this is Judas betraying Jesus with a kiss, showing the essentially like the Roman police, the Roman guards, who Jesus was in this dark garden. This is, I believe, John the Baptist over here, who's kind of shouting out in horror. So way over here on the right, this is actually another self-portrait of Caravaggio. He's holding this lantern, which actually isn't a light source in the painting, but he's like illuminating this betrayal. And you can almost understand him as like a mob of one in this picture. He's just bringing a little bit of chaos to this, but he is shining a light nonetheless. And he does this, he uses his influence in two important ways throughout his career. The first is as a conduit of the Catholic Church. He created these very powerful pictures that brought people in for worship. The other piece of this, as we'll see, is that he as an artist was so influential, and his ideas and his aesthetic will spread like wildfire throughout Europe. So Caravaggio, the influencer, there's one last big idea here, and that is Caravaggio, the villain. Go back to our contrast with the Renaissance here. So I bring back Michelangelo's David on the left, and we contrast that with Caravaggio's depiction of David from very late in his career. This is from about 1610. And Caravaggio is reminding us here that David didn't just use the slingshot. Once David was able to take down the giant Goliath, he uses a sword and beheads him. And Caravaggio actually painted his own face on the head of Goliath here. This really kind of repulsive depiction of the villain of Goliath. And at this point in his life, spoiler, there was a bounty on Caravaggio's head. He was wanted for the worst crime of all, and he was going to be punished by beheading. He sort of becomes obsessed with it and starts painting it quite a bit. So he himself was a villain. Maybe he is processing that to a certain degree with a painting like this. Maybe he's even asking for forgiveness in some way. But we have our big ideas. He lived at a rough time. He was wild and out of control. He was incredibly influential, and he was the bad guy. So often when we look at an artist, they're the good guy. You're always rooting for them. But this guy, no, in no way. So we're going to turn our attention now to one of the things that makes Caravaggio's painting so extraordinary, and that is this astonishing realism that he was able to capture. Now, I kind of lied to you so far. I've been setting up this nice contrast between the Renaissance and the Baroque, and it was one thing and then the other. Well, there was actually something that came in the middle of those two things. It was Renaissance, mannerism, and then Baroque. This was another thing that Caravaggio sort of has to respond to. So mannerism comes about halfway through the 1500s, and you can think of it as like this exaggeration of Renaissance ideals. And exaggeration is the name of the game here, because artists begin to elongate and exaggerate the forms of the figures that they are painting. The classic example is Parmigianino's painting of the Madonna of the long neck. She literally has some extra vertebrae there and sort of a disgustingly long Christ child here, and another long naked leg to just frame things out. So we can see this exaggeration of form. This always kind of reminds me of, in the quest for perfection, people sometimes get plastic surgery, but then it's like all you see is the surgery. All you see is the like affectation, essentially. So we see that even with Michelangelo. This is a detail of the Last Judgment wall on in the Sistine Chapel, and these are figures that are being pulled down to hell. And we can see Michelangelo is just summoning all of these muscles on these figures that don't actually exist on human bodies. So he's adding muscles. Parmigianino is adding vertebrae. Michelangelo is also putting these figures in really kind of wild, unnecessarily complicated positions. If you're going to pull someone down to hell, do they have to be like doing a backward somersault as they go down? So it's really all about affectation at this point. And I share all of this because Caravaggio effectively brings all of this back down to earth with a picture like this. And this is really kind of like a breakthrough work for him very early on in his career. Now, he had moved to Rome and he was just kind of painting anything he could, any painting job he could get. And it was like hack work. It would have been like the equivalent of painting pictures for home goods, but back in the 1600s. So here he sort of sets himself apart in an astonishing, beautiful, breathtaking way. This is just simply Basket of Fruit from 1597. And it's a picture all about this kind of intense realism that we'll be seeing throughout his paintings. So first, I want to start off with the basket itself. We can see that it is carefully rendered, carefully observed. It's also depicted in such a way that it looks like it's coming over the edge of the table that it's on. We see that little shadow there, and it makes you want to kind of reach out and pull it in, like pull it off the table, bring it into your space completely. This is Caravaggio involving us, the viewer, in a very subtle way. So he gives us this basket of fruit, which the more time you spend with it, the less appealing it looks, right? The fruit, like this apple, has a wormhole in it. There's brown spots up over here on this pear. And all of these leaves that are still attached to the fruit, some of them are all dried up and shriveled. Some of them just have pieces that look like they're dying. Some of them have been, eaten by by insects. There's not a lot here that looks too appealing. It's so hyper realistic. Now it's so close to Caravaggio's observed reality here that botanists can actually look at this painting and determine what kind of insects chewed through these leaves. That's just blows my mind. That's how carefully observed this is. Now, we don't have all of that shadow that he becomes very well known for, but we do have the shallow pictorial space, and we do have him using just, essentially the bottom half of the total space of the canvas here. So he's making bold choices. He's rejecting a lot of Renaissance principles, even with a simple fruit still life. Now, this next image here is just another one of these fruit still lifes, almost identical to what we were just looking at. And it's sort of a small detail in a bigger picture, but I wanted to start with it just to show you how close it is to what we were just looking at. And also because it's easy to miss once we look at the total painting. This one really looks like it's teetering over the edge of the table here, but we can see the dried up leaves. We can see the brown spots on the fruit here. It's looking less and less appealing, right? And oh, even the basket is kind of coming unwoven. Now we're going to zoom out and take a look at the entire painting. And like I said, your eye does not go straight to that basket of fruit. The basket of fruit just serves as a nice little punctuation mark once you deduce what's happening here. So this is Caravaggio's painting of Supper at Emmaus, painted right in like this golden part of his career, 1601. This is at the National Gallery in London. And here we begin to see some of that realism that I've been talking about. We already saw it with the fruit still life, but pay attention to like the way people are dressed. Pay attention to how old figures are, how clean their hair and their hands and their feet are. Notice how often he's giving us figures with these wrinkled or furrowed brows, figures with graying beards like this. These look like real people that you would encounter in everyday life. So the story of Supper at Emmaus was that two of Christ's followers, sometime after Christ's death, were traveling and they stopped at an inn for dinner. And Christ goes to visit these followers. He is deceased, but he goes incognito and then suddenly reveals himself. And so this is that moment of revelation, literally. And so we can see this follower of Christ is about to stand up from his chair. The other one spreads his arms wide. Notice how it feels like that hand is reaching out towards us, just in the same way that this gesture of blessing of Christ feels like it's coming out towards us. This is some of that dynamism of the Italian Baroque. Now, Caravaggio painted Jesus as a young man without a beard. That's sort of the suggestion of his disguise, or how his followers didn't immediately recognize him. And it's really just his followers that are having this moment of revelation. This is the man who's waiting on them at the inn, and he's blasé. He doesn't know what's happening here. But he does lead our eye to that cellar window lighting. And of course, we've got the shadowy dark background. We've got our shallow space here. Feels like it's taking place on a stage just for us, right? Brings us in with all of these lovely still life elements and the people that look so very real. So that realism extends to this next picture as well. This is the Pilgrim's Madonna, painted in 1604 to 1606. This is installed on the wall in a church in Rome, and it would probably be just over the height of my head. So maybe about 6 feet off the ground. So pilgrims, people who are going to that church to worship, they'd be looking up at this depiction of the Madonna, of the Christ child, and the people that traveled there to worship them. And the first thing that they would probably see looking up at this picture are those very dirty feet. Caravaggio is not sparing us what the details of grungy life in Rome at this time. He's not trying to make the divine physically perfect. That's not why they're being worshipped, right? So he gives us, an older woman with sagging skin. He gives us pilgrims with dirty hands. He even has the Madonna living in this structure here that seems to be kind of run down. She is also barefoot, and she and the Christ child just have these tiny little halos to suggest their divinity. In every other way, they're just like the people that are worshiping them. So Caravaggio has found a very powerful message to communicate with worshipers, and it's one that sticks. So I think I have just one last picture here to underscore this realism that Caravaggio used that was so revolutionary for the time. This is one of his biggest, most ambitious paintings. It's about 12 feet tall. Oops. Um, and this is at the Louvre in Paris, because this is actually a commission that was rejected by the church that commissioned it. So this is the death of the Virgin. And we can see her down here laying on this table. She has passed away. She's wearing this red dress here that's kind of echoed by this big red drapery that's taking up the entire top half of the composition. She is being grieved by Christ's followers, including Mary Magdalene in the foreground here. Now, he has not portrayed the Virgin, the mother of Christ, in in a way that most people would expect. You would expect her to be, wrapped up in a shroud and looking kind of respectable. Instead, you see her exposed swollen ankles. You see that her dress has kind of come undone, her arms kind of like lolling out to the side, and her head's kind of lolling off to the side as well. I think her lips are just kind of parted too. Um, it's really an ungainly pose. It's not any way that any one of us would want to be memorialized, right? I mean, if somebody took a picture of you sleeping and you looked like this, you wouldn't want anybody to see that. So it's not a flattering depiction of the Virgin. That was one of the objections that his clients had when they looked at this. But the other was that there were, rumors about who actually was the model for this particular virgin. And there were rumors that it was a prostitute that Caravaggio had been dating, also that it was a dead prostitute who had been pulled from the river. So just with the swirling rumors, all of that, this gets dismissed. Now, the other problem with this picture, particularly if you're Catholic, is that it doesn't subscribe to the Catholic belief of the Assumption of the Virgin. And that is that the corporal being that was Madonna just gets assumed up into heaven, fully formed, and becomes the Queen of Heaven. I think that is beautifully illustrated by Fra Angelico in this little painting that's at the Gardner Museum in Boston. It's kind of easy to miss amongst all the treasures at the Gardner Museum, but we can see here at the bottom of the composition, you have the Madonna sort of modestly draped here, shrouded. You have Christ's followers surrounding her, but nobody's like acting out. There aren't overwhelming expressions of grief here that are very close to, our lived experience, but there's much more respect and decorum. And then we have the upper panel where she has just arrived in heaven. She's wearing this beautiful gown. The angels are welcoming her, as is her son at the top of the composition. So Caravaggio sort of missed the mark with this picture, apparently. It was just a little too gritty for his clients at the time. So with that, we're going to shift gears and we're going to think about another aspect of Caravaggio's paintings that was so revolutionary for the time. And actually, I'm going to go back to sculpture for a moment to help us understand this a little bit better. So we're back to that contrast between Michelangelo's Renaissance David, and Bernini's Baroque David. And remember, the Baroque David, he needed you to walk all the way around. He wanted to involve you. Michelangelo's David, just stand right in front of him and gaze upon him adoringly. That's what we're all there to do. So I'm going to stay with Bernini for a moment and show you another work by this Italian Baroque artist so that you can see how Italian Baroque artists were so concerned with how to engage viewers, how to involve viewers. So this is another work by Bernini, and it's called The Ecstasy of Saint Teresa. This is a work that Caravaggio actually never would have seen, but it's emblematic of the period. So stay with me here. Now, this nun, Saint Teresa here, had these like quasi-erotic visions of an angel like plunging this arrow into her entrails, and it was painful but pleasurable, and it was like the love of God. So we can see this beautiful angel gazing adoringly down at Saint Teresa here. We can see the arrow, and we can see the angel just lifting up Saint Teresa's drapery. All of this is awesome. All of it's amazing. You've probably noticed these golden beams around them as well. That's actually part of the sculpture, because if we back out just a little bit, we can see that Bernini actually designed a whole stage set for this sculpture, complete with dramatic stage lighting, very similar to what Caravaggio would have painted, right? There is actually a window just behind this cornice up here. So there's natural light coming down these golden beams to illuminate this nun's vision. And it's all playing out on a stage set for us to observe. This is like a Caravaggio painting in 3 dimensions, but it doesn't stop there. Are you ready for this? If you back out even further, this entire composition, this whole stage set is in this chapel area where Bernini has actually added these little like balcony seats and sculpture busts of people from the church who would have been donors for his sculpture at the center here. So it is as though this is a theatrical production that that has patrons, that has theater seating, and is involving us, the viewer, in every way imaginable. So that's what we get when we go back to painting as well. So I'm going to bring you into this church in Rome. And here we are standing in the nave, that main wide aisle of a church. Here's the plan for this church. And so when you enter a church like this in Rome, normally we're most concerned with the major sort of decorative scheme. We're looking at the murals on the ceiling in the nave, or at the end of the nave in the altar space. But these churches in Rome have seen some of the greatest artists over time. So some of these little side aisle niches, some of these side chapels have been decorated by some of the greatest artists, including Caravaggio. So I'm going to sort of swing you around, and we're going to look into one of these side chapels here. Here is a Caravaggio painting. I want to draw your attention to the fact too that there is like this half moon window just above it. And these side chapels are usually spaces that the general public can't even enter. You can see on the plan here that there's like even a little wall keeping people out generally. But as we approach that side chapel with the little window at the top, we can see there is the calling of St. Matthew. That's that picture that we started with. And we can see that Caravaggio knew that there would be this one source of light on his painting, and he like channels that, he uses it in his picture. That holy light that illuminates St. Matthew's soul in this picture is echoed by the natural light in the building. So there is this sense that the picture is site specific and involves the viewer and is responsive to the very setting, the architecture that it inhabits. And we have a couple more examples of this. I just find this so exciting. So in another side chapel, and I believe this is definitely in a different church, we have another conversion painting. This is the conversion on the way to Damascus. This is Paul's conversion from Saul. When he was Saul, he was a bully. He hated the Christians. He would persecute them. But as he's traveling to Damascus, he sees the light, literally, and converts to Christianity. And Caravaggio paints this with, again, this kind of spectacular light flooding in from above. Paul has just fallen off his horse. His body is like receding back into depth, sort of foreshortened for our purposes, but also at this interesting angle here too. Um, it seems like it seems like his arms are wide, embracing this heavenly light. It also seems like he is in danger of being trampled by this horse, which is being controlled by this older gentleman here, who again looks like a working person from Rome. You know, he's got the furrowed brow, he's got the thinning hair, he's got the dirty hands and bare feet. So there's all these wonderful details that kind of bring you into the picture. But I would argue that the angle of this body was very carefully chosen for the placement of the picture inside this tiny side chapel here, because we would be standing roughly where we are in this picture, and the angle there is so dramatic. I think it's sort of emphasized by the angle at which we see the actual picture. It brings us in, it makes us curious, it involves us. And Caravaggio does the exact same thing in the picture just opposite it. This is kind of a grisly picture here. This is the crucifixion of St. Peter, where St. Peter was unfortunately crucified upside down. It's so distressing to even think about anyone dying that way, but we can see him here responding to the wounds that he already has. We can see these kind of three anonymous figures who are struggling to put the cross upright. Again, notice the dirty feet, right? And we see Peter looking very much like an older man, you know, with the sort of loose flesh on his abdomen, the furrowed brow, the soft gray beard here. So there's this realism that makes, I think, the brutality of the scene so visceral. But we also have these strong diagonals here, the diagonal of the cross, and then also this diagonal sort of shift of, or I should say, this diagonal line really that's created by the legs of this person at the bottom and sort of continues up through Peter's face. So when you look at this picture in situ, on site, those strong diagonals again lead you into the painting. They are emphasized in the painting by the angle at which the viewer would see the picture. It's really smart on the part of Caravaggio. So just to give you a sense in terms of the size of this particular side chapel here, and if you're standing right there at the center, how these strong diagonals really bring you into those compositions. Here's just a little bit further out. I mean, they'd be easy to miss. Maybe some of you have even walked through this church and missed the Caravaggios there. So I have one last site-specific Caravaggio for you, and this is the Entombment of Christ from 1603. This is in another church, I believe this is in Rome. And what we have here, of course, are the mourning followers of Christ who are about to lay his body to rest after the crucifixion. We have the three Marys expressing grief in three different ways. We have these very realistic followers of Christ that are holding up his body. And then this very stark contrast of the white linens and the white flesh of Jesus's body with this shadowy, dark background. Caravaggio involves us in the scene because these figures are standing not really on a tomb, but on this cut stone that comes out at this angle into our space. So we sort of get the sense that they're about to lay him down on this cut stone. It's almost as though it was an altar. And Caravaggio, in fact, painted this picture to function as though it is behind an altar, because in this particular side chapel in this church, this is the spot where the priest would bless the Eucharist. So as he holds up the Eucharist and says, "This is the body of Christ," this is the very understanding of transubstantiation, the notion that when you take the Eucharist, when at a Catholic Mass, that you are eating the body of Christ. And here is Caravaggio showing us the followers of Christ laying him down on that altar to become the Eucharist. It's incredibly smart. It's incredibly powerful. So he knew how to involve his audiences. He knew how to play off the architecture of the spaces that he was there to adorn, and he did really revolutionary things for the times. But for our time, we have just a little bit of time to talk about what a bad boy Caravaggio was. And he really was a bad boy. So instead of going through like the exact timeline of all the things that he did, I'm going to show you how the crimes in his paintings slowly escalate. And I will compare that to the kinds of crimes that he was committing, and we'll see how they were also kind of escalating over time. So, as with a lot of criminals, some of the first crimes, they're kind of harmless offenses. This is a famous early painting called The Card Sharps from 1594. And this one is in the US, down in Fort Worth, Texas at the Kimball Art Museum. So what we see here is, of course, cheating at cards. This is like one of my favorite themes in the history of art. It's always fun to kind of figure out who is the dupe in this, who's working together, and who's being played. So Caravaggio usually makes a well-dressed young man as the fool, and so these two men with the feathers in their caps are signaling to each other and swapping out cards so that they can beat this young man. So incidentally, we'll see that cheating at cards becomes a favorite subject in the 1600s, and I'm going to give Caravaggio all the credit for that because these are really fun pictures to look at. Now it's early. He hasn't quite come to, all the chiaroscuro and the deep dark shadows yet. It's still kind of light and fun. And that's a little bit of a parallel for what was happening in Caravaggio's own life. Some of the bad boy things that he was doing, they didn't really hurt anybody. He got sued for libel. He actually wrote a mean poem about another artist. I mean, that's not too bad, right? If you're dying to know who the other artist it was a man by the name of Giovanni Baglioni. So this next image is from roughly the same time. We see another handsome young boy who is getting his fortune told by a young gypsy woman. And so we can see that she's kind of caressing his palm. They're gazing into each other's eyes. And this is, believe it or not, another crime. If you zoom in, which we will do, apparently, I guess we're going to have to trust the art historians on this. Apparently, you can see that she is stealing his ring. Maybe that's it there. I think it's pretty hard to see. So again, not the worst crime you could commit. And in terms of a parallel to Caravaggio's life, I'll just give you a sense that he was getting arrested for things like swearing at a constable. He also cut a hole in his own ceiling to let in more light, which led to probably a lot of disputes with his landlady that we'll hear about as well. So fairly harmless stuff in the grand scheme of things, but things escalate, not just in his life, but in his paintings. Now we're beginning to see some blood. Granted, it's mythological blood right now, right? So this is, of course, Medusa, the enchantress who has snakes for hair. This is a painting from 1597. It's actually a ceremonial shield that he has painted here that was presented to a member of the Medici family. So if you remember your mythology, Medusa with the snakes for hair, any living thing that she looked at, she turned it to stone. And it was Perseus who figured out how to take out Medusa. He used his own shield as a mirror, didn't look at her directly in the eye, and was able to slice her head off. So this is that horrifying moment where her head goes flying, and of course Caravaggio has to paint the gushing blood and the horrified expression on her face. Again, this is a little bit of a understanding of the actual space of the shield too, because this is a convex surface that this is painted on. So we get a little bit of horror here, and it corresponds to Caravaggio's life quite nicely, because at this point he's starting to get arrested for things like carrying weapons. He was carrying a sword and a dagger without a permit, and He also got in trouble for throwing stones at the police. So it's getting worse. And now it gets really bad in terms of the paintings. This is his portrayal of Judith beheading Holofernes. This dates to 1598, and it's probably one of his most famous, probably one of his most influential works too. So we've gone from the mythological realm to the religious realm. Judith here, who's doing the dirty work, she was a beautiful Jewish widow from the Bible who becomes a heroine because this Assyrian general, Holofernes, he and his army are laying siege to her town. So she decides to take matters into her own hands and go to his tent, get him drunk, seduce him, and then behead him. And of course, Caravaggio is going to show the bloodiest moment of all. Now, artists have been depicting Judith for centuries. Most of the time, they just show a really pretty lady with a sword, sometimes with a head, but never really in the act. And the act is horrifying, right? She's holding on to his hair. He's like, mouth wide open. We can actually see his head separating from his body. It's a dark scene, and it's a brutal one. So Caravaggio takes us right into the action here. And of course, this is what was happening in his life too. He was arrested multiple times for assaulting people, including a waiter, a guard, and a rival. And in this case, that assault against one of his rivals ends up becoming a murder. So this brings us to one of Caravaggio's very late works and sort of a culmination of everything in his life, a reflection on his body of work and also on a life of crime. So after he ends up murdering this rival of his, he has to flee Rome. He has been sentenced to death. There's a bounty on his head. So he's moving around Italy. Every town that he goes to, he becomes the most celebrated painter there. But he is trying to escape the law and certainly trying to escape other people who are seeking vengeance for the death of his rival. So he ends up on this tiny island of Malta. It's like very small, way out beyond Sicily even, and it's just in the middle of the ocean. And he's kind of got some protection from this order of knights on the island of Malta. And so he does this very large painting for them of the death of John the Baptist. So it's about 17 feet across, this painting. It's got, the shallow pictorial space. It's got a lot of that shadow that we saw before, a little bit of this light coming in, even though we're in an alley here. It seems like cellar window lighting. So John the Baptist in this painting has been pulled out of prison. Here's some other prisoners in jail. Here's the jailer with his keys. And his death has been ordered. He is to be beheaded, and his head is to go into this golden bowl for the figure of Salome. And we see this older woman here holding her own head in response to the horror of what she is witnessing. So John the Baptist is already on the ground. His throat has already been cut. Then here's like the wild part to the story. And it's just like, like I said, this is something that feels like it's from a true crime novel, because this is the only work that Caravaggio ever signed. And he signed it in John the Baptist's blood. So I'm going to zoom in on that for you. You can see that name of his, Michelangelo, here. And some art historians interpret this text in blood to actually say Michelangelo did it or did this. So it could be like, I did this painting, or I did it. It's a confession to the murder that he actually committed. So it's so fascinating to think about him trying to atone for his sins in this last great work of his. And then just to give you a sense of the scale of this painting, here is I think the Prince Charles, or no, Prince, one of those princes, is standing there looking at the painting, and we can see just its grand scale and just what a dark picture it is as well. I believe that's still there in Malta. So we'll wrap up tonight thinking about Caravaggio's legacy and influence. Now, we go back to the artist himself for a moment here. How did he die? Well, he was just 38 years old, and there's a lot of different ideas actually about how he died. It's almost like a choose your own adventure, whichever story seems right to you. For the longest time, I always read that he died of a fever. He was sick and he died of a fever. Maybe he had a cut and he died of a fever. There's another theory out there that he was hunted down by the friends or family of that rival that he killed. They sought their vengeance and he was executed. I've also read that he died of syphilis. So there's all these other ideas, but in the end, he dies at the age of 38. Now, he never really had an official school of painting, never had any students. And shortly after his death, people kind of forgot his name. And yet, somehow, his style of painting spread like a virus across the continent of Europe and held strong for nearly 100 years. You wouldn't have Rembrandt without Caravaggio. You wouldn't have Vermeer without Caravaggio. He had extraordinary influence on not just the century, but the entire history of art from that moment forward. So I'm just going to map this out for you just a little bit. We can see that other Italian artists, even during his lifetime, were copying what he was doing. We're looking and responding to his work. This is a famous depiction of Judith and Holofernes by Artemisia Gentileschi. And some could argue that hers is more successful. I personally feel that way, but I don't think she ever would have painted this without Caravaggio's painting as an example. Other Italian artists were looking at his work. This is Caravaggio's work over here on the left, and creating nearly identical compositions with that shadowy black background and the spotlit figures who are pushed so close to the picture plane here. But it wasn't just in Italy. His influence went so much further. So we have French artists who are taking up this subject of people cheating at cards and creating more complicated compositions in response to Caravaggio's example. I particularly love this French example from Georges de la Tour, where you have this epic side eye as they're trying to cheat, portray or at least relay who has what cards in this game. Now, this idea of cheating at cards, it continues on throughout the 1600s. This is this lovely little Jan Steen painting, a Dutch painting, where in this case, our card cheater is looking out directly at us with an ace in the hand and another one on the floor. And her compatriot over here is, plying their rube here with some drink. So, some of these ideas, they just catch hold. We see it all the way up into the Netherlands, but it also spreads to Spain. This is Caravaggio's painting of Saint Francis of Assisi. This is Zurbarán's painting of the same subject, nearly an identical composition. I don't think Zurbarán would have arrived here, especially with all that shadow, without Caravaggio's example. Incidentally, if you like St. Francis of Assisi, he is my favorite saint. You don't have to go far to see Caravaggio's other painting of him because it's just right down the road in Connecticut at the Wadsworth Athenaeum. This is the ecstasy of St. Francis of Assisi, worth seeing in person. So, as we think about his influence and his legacy, I think it's also important to think about the value of these works today. This is a nativity scene, sort of a muddled, kind of complicated nativity scene that Caravaggio painted for a church in Palermo, Italy, and it was designed to hang just above the altar here. But in 1969, thieves entered the church and actually cut Caravaggio's painting right out of the frame there and rolled it up and walked away. Believe it or not, this is still one of the top 10 art crimes listed by the FBI on their website. So this missing Caravaggio, which was almost certainly destroyed in its removal, is still, people are still looking for it. The FBI, I think, estimated that it would be worth $20 million. That is extraordinarily low, and maybe that's a reflection on the fact that it was likely so damaged. But just a few years ago, in 2019, somebody in France found this painting in their attic and thought, this could be a Caravaggio. So it went up for auction. I think it was authenticated by some Caravaggio scholars. So it was going to go up for auction. And it's not very often that a Caravaggio just appears out of thin air. So people expected it to sell for close to $200 million. Well, what happened? This very large painting, it's so grotesque, isn't it? Another Judith and Holofernes here. This painting was actually snatched up by a buyer before it even went to auction. So they probably paid way more than $170 million for it. So I think the value and the interest in Caravaggio is probably at an all-time high, right? So with it being just past 8 o'clock, I have just one last slide for you in these two images here, two Caravaggio paintings to end on, to wrap everything up for us, because this is our chance to sort of reflect on what Caravaggio does for us. Over here on the left, this is a painting called Boy Being Bitten by a Lizard. I know that lizard is a little bit hard to see, but here he is. And you can see this sense of like shock and sort of disgust on the face of this young boy. Over on the right is Narcissus, the figure that falls in love with his own reflection as he's gazing at it in the water. So I think these two pictures kind of sum up our relationship with Caravaggio. There's so many things that he painted and that he did in his own life that are, I think, offensive and disgusting and shocking. But there are so many paintings that are just absolutely mesmerizing, and you can lose yourself in the astonishingly beautiful details of them. So I will end there for now, and I welcome any questions or comments you have about Caravaggio. I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you. Let's see here. Oh, somebody says, have you seen the new graphic novel on Caravaggio? I have not. Thank you for adding that. Actually, I just heard from Jill at the Chelmsford Public Library. She was processing some new books there, and she she had to send me a picture of the cover of sort of like a romance novel about Caravaggio. It looked like a real kind of like, what are those called? Like a bodice ripper kind of thing. Tamara asks, who were the customers for the paintings that display the horrible events? That's a great question. Let me just double check that. I think virtually all of these were religious commissions. Um, Although Judith beheading Holofernes is at an art museum, I don't know offhand who commissioned it, but I would, it's a religious story, so I would imagine that it was a religious commission. If anybody knows differently, please feel free to join in. Great question, Tamara, because it's hard to imagine somebody saying like, paint the blood, right? Margaret says, who did he murder? Okay, let's see if we're looking for his actual name here. I have it in my notes. Just a moment. Let's see. Um, do I have it in my notes? I should. I think it would take me too long to find it in my notes at this point. He stabbed his rival in a sword fight in 1606. His rival died from his wounds. He was rumored to have sort of almost like mafia type connections in Rome. So I think this idea that Caravaggio was killed as a result of a vendetta makes a great deal of sense to me. I'm just seeing if I can find that name. I think it's Ranuccio Tomassoni. I should have had that at the tip of my tongue. Ranuccio Tomassoni. The details of the death are pretty grisly. You can find them on Wikipedia. if you want a good read. Thank you everybody for your kind words. Philomena says, what kind of training did he have? Did he apprentice with anyone? I don't have those details at the top of my brain, but I'm going to see if I have them in my notes here. Um, I know he did apprentice with an artist in Milan as a teenager. The artist's name was Simone Pietrozano. So not necessarily a great master that we've all heard of, but he did receive some artistic training that sort of got him set up to at least make like eke out an existence for himself in Rome, and then he kind of gets discovered. Great question, Philomena. Thank you for asking it. I should have had that in there. Um, Thank you so much, everybody, for the very kind words. I really appreciate it. Caravaggio just delivers the scandal, right? It's entertaining. Wrath and riot indeed. Thanks for the comments, Nancy. Thank you again, everybody. Oh, David says he saw Bernini's David in Rome. Exquisite. I'm gonna have to go back to Rome. I think I missed it when I was there. Suzanne asked, how did he learn to paint? He did apprentice with someone. I think you probably, I just answered that, so you probably just heard that. And Susan says, what was his sexual preference? Oh, I like the saucy question, Susan. He definitely had female partners. I don't know if there was anything else beyond that. And there's some speculation that the fight with his rival was over a sexual partner too. So I don't have any spicy details for you on that part of his life, Susan. But thank you for asking. Mary, thanks for coming tonight. It's great to see your name. Oh, and Cindy and Dave, you too. Nancy, I recognize so many of these names, and I always appreciate everybody coming. So thank you so much. Um, okay, so let's see, I'm just trying to sort through for some questions here, and I didn't even look at the Q&A, but there's 19 questions there. Is the portrait in charcoal? Margaret asks. I believe that is a charcoal portrait. And I think she was commenting on uh, Mary dressed in blue and red. Judith says, which church in Rome are these paintings? Judith, if you send me a follow-up email, I can give you that information. I have it in all of my slides. We can craft your own little Caravaggio tour for you. But I'll spare everybody else with my horrible Italian pronunciations. Alice says, what religion was Saul before he converted to Christianity? You stumped me. I'm not sure. I'm gonna guess that he was a pagan, Alice, but it's just a guess. Judy Gross is here. Judy, thanks for being here. In the murder of John the Baptist, what is lying on the ground next to his left knee? Great question, Judy. Let's go back to that. It's like a little animal body, right? Well, it looks like an animal body. He wore like this hair shirt. So I'm imagining that's what that is. I'm so glad you asked that. Gil says, was it common for artists to know specifically where their works would be placed in a church or built ahead of time? It's a really good question. I mean, certainly Michelangelo knew with the Sistine Chapel, and I'm just wondering if other artists knew. I think they typically did. I think, I'm thinking of the great artists of the Italian Renaissance. They definitely knew where their pictures were destined for. So I have a good sense that Caravaggio knew that as well, especially when we think of like the lighting for St. Matthew and the lighting in that little side chapel. Like this is kind of unmistakable to me. Someone else asks, have there ever been objections to the displays of Caravaggio's work because of his crimes? I will tell you that there's plenty of people these days that object to looking at his works, even when I show them in reproduction. So I'm sure there have been plenty of objections over time. I love Netflix true crime stuff. I can handle this, but there's a lot of people that, this just turns their stomach, and I understand it. And this is not how they want to spend their free time looking at really graphic, violent works like this. So plenty of people today still object to his works, but I'm not I don't think that people like object to his paintings being on display or like protest his exhibitions or anything like that. Are the two peaches and bunch of grapes on the table in Bacchus meant to represent male genitalia? JD, another spicy question. Chelmsford, you just don't disappoint. Let's go back to the fruit. Oh no, Bacchus, young sick Bacchus here. Here he is. I'm gonna say yes. It does seem quite suggestive, doesn't it? We all draw our own associations based on our experiences, don't we, JD? Thank you for your question. So most of his paintings were not signed. As far as I know, the only signed painting was that one of the death of John the Baptist at the end of his life. We've answered the question about his training. Thanks for kind words, David. How did he learn to paint? Yep, we've touched on that. Did he have a teacher? Yes. Did he have a wife? Children? No. Like I said, he was like involved in a gang, really. They had a mantra. Their slogan for their gang was basically no hope, no fear. It was pretty grim. So I think he frequented prostitutes, and that was how he found connection. So if people are really interested in Caravaggio, there's a really fun and dramatic and well done video by Simon Shama, who is, you can find the whole thing on YouTube. He just makes the whole thing so dramatic and really fun to watch. So it's called The Power of Art Caravaggio with Simon Shama. Why do you think Caravaggio would paint symbols pointing to proof of his atoning for his crimes? Maybe he was okay with living dangerously immoral, maybe. But you know what, Jan? I mean, great comment. And it's, great stuff for us to ponder. But I think he was pretty worried about being beheaded if he were to be caught. So maybe he was trying to process all of that in some of those last paintings. Somebody asked, do I give other talks? I give so many of them. Please go to my website, which is iamculturallycurious.com. I'll put that in the chat. And on the calendar page of my website are links to other live talks that I'm giving via Zoom. Some are in person, but they're all free. Adele asks, I had the impression that he was rejected by the church and his work was ignored for 300 years until an exhibit in Milan in 1951. I could imagine that the church got pretty frustrated with him. I mean, he was celebrated at least for a short time. But like I said, nobody really remembered him shortly after his death. I think he was just a problem that people wanted to go away at a certain point. And yes, sort of rediscovered years later. But that influence, what he did, it did still spread, even though it wasn't necessarily connected to him, which is kind of fascinating, right? Somebody else asked, didn't he throw food at a waiter? Indeed, he did. Artichokes. He was upset about artichokes and he threw the whole thing at a waiter. I mean, this guy, it's like he was made for Bravo TV, right? Jack, thanks for your kind words. Terrence says, oh, thank you for the kind words. And Vicky, prior to this evening, I was not a fan of Caravaggio. Oh, glad I could turn you around on him. And yes, we all have to go to Rome now and see all of these paintings in person. What's next for me? Oh, are you ready for this? Next month, we are in for such a treat. Okay, so I'm going to be doing a program on the Harlem Renaissance, and it's like where my head is at right now. The images are extraordinary and really delightful. So we will be looking at first I thought, oh, we're just going to focus in on like maybe 5 artists, but there's so many of them that we're going to do some themes, and I'm going to show you as many artists as I can. Such great paintings. It will be a treat. That's probably the last Thursday of next month, but you can see it sooner if you find the calendar links on my website. I debut it next week. Let's see. Nancy says, where can we see Caravaggio in the US? Hartford, National Gallery of Art, Fort Worth, Texas, at the Kimball Museum. And somebody said, was that a self-portrait in the lizard bite painting? Great question. You're probably onto something. It looked a lot like him, but it also looked a lot like all of his models. looked a lot like everybody that he painted. So maybe I could be persuaded. Yeah. It's such a, yeah, could be. You never know. I like even being prompted to think about it. So I think we've gone through pretty much everything. And I so appreciate everybody's engagement with the artist and with everything I presented tonight. Thank you so much, everybody. And I think I get to end tonight's program. All right. So thank you again. I hope to see you next month when we look at the work of the artists of the Harlem Renaissance and its legacy. So it was a delight. Take care. Have a great night. I'll see you soon. Bye, everyone.